Chapter 1. Welcome to my world. "You little bastards, where are you?" We lay deadly silent, never moving an inch. I could hear Mam pleading with him to leave us alone, which would always end up with her getting a good hard slap. He was a 6-foot-tall 7-stoner and as strong as a bull from lifting beer kegs all day. None of us stood a chance against that. No one in their right mind would cross him. We tried to ignore him, but we could hear his voice getting more and more aggressive. We were all looking at each other and shaking with fear. Mam was still pleading, doing anything she could to protect us, telling him we were just kids. He didn't like any backchat. There was a silence. Then an almighty slap, followed by a long scream. Instinctively, the three of us jumped out of bed and ran down the stairs and started screaming at him to stop it. He just saw this as sport and lashed out at us, catching us on our backs with his heavy hands, making us cry more. Tears on top of tears. We then climbed onto Mam, who was also in tears, and tried to protect her. He stopped and looked at us all cowering and called us all soft shites. He walked to the kitchen and cracked open a bottle of Newcastle brown ale. It had gained the nicknames Mad Dog and Wife Beater round the doors. Very appropriate in this case. We all know what was coming next. He called the three of us in, and then he started the interrogation. It was always the same. He would start off by saying that he would batter us if we went thieving. "What do you say if the police arrest you?" he'd ask. We'd just be standing silently with our backs still red raw with the heavy-handed slaps, with tears still streaming down our faces, sniffling like kids do. If one of us piped up and said, "We say nothing, Dad," that'd be the trigger for the slaps to come raining down on us again. Mam would always try to help, but she couldn't because he was just too strong. What made it a million times worse was that he was picking on his own family, and it didn't seem to bother him one bit. He'd then grab us all by the hair and drag us into the backyard while we'd scream and plead for him to stop. Then, nothing. Nothing at all. He'd be done. He'd leave us in the backyard. Didn't matter if it was freezing cold, he'd just leave us there shivering. We'd climb into the dog's kennel one by one and then huddle together for the night ahead. John and I kept Michael in the middle to protect him, and we covered ourselves in stinking old coats that our dog Judy lay on. Judy seemed to sense our distress and snuggled into us to try and keep us warm. She was good like that. We'd watch through the window as my dad beat my poor Mam up. In his mind, maybe he thought leaving us to sleep in the dog's kennel would make us better people. That memory will be with me to the day I die. From that day on, we all swore that we would never let anybody lift their hands to us again. We were kids, we were small, but things like that bond you closer than anything. During the 6-week summer holiday, I'd work on my Uncle Albert's barrow in town. Each day I'd wake up with a noise in me granny shouting, "Do you want a cup of tea, son?" I'd get myself washed and ready and would head downstairs where Uncle Albert would be waiting. He'd always get his stock before coming to ask me if I wanted to go to work with him, and then we'd walk from Gran's on Westgate Road to the Granger Market in town, where we'd be greeted by my uncles, Thomas and Georgie Kelly, who were in the same game. As a youngster doing this, it were a great buzz, just to be part of something grown up, something that was useful and part of life. Like I was learning something but didn't really know what at the time. They'd compare stock, and then we'd make our way to the van that would be parked on Nunn Street and start unloading the barrows. Uncle Albert would put his barrow outside the clock bar and we'd get to work. He'd flash the barrow up so it looked presentable to customers, getting all the signs written out, all the stock piled and priced, and then we'd be ready for action. There was always something going on round the Granger Market. You could guarantee come 10:30 in the morning, my cousins Michael and Terry Patterson would drive past us. You could actually set your watch by them. They were always that late to the market in the morning. People used to say they were actually arriving early for the following day, but they just used to laugh and crack on. They had their own pace and nobody was going to speed them up. Uncle Albert would put our price labels up and scales out. The good thing about working for me uncle was that he would always buy you a sandwich and a cup of tea, whereas the other barrow boys would tell you to help yourself to fruit off the barrow. I'd prefer a sarnie any day of the week, still would, but especially when you're surrounded by fruit. It wasn't a treat if it was in front of you and free, was it? Those holidays were great times, not a care in the world, working outside with the sun on my face, a full belly, a bit of money in my pocket, no bother from the police. The only bad thing with holidays is that they have to come to an end, and I'd have to go back to school and start a whole new year. That feeling inside when you knew the holidays were ending. 6 weeks that just weren't long enough. Endless days, light nights, and you'd feel it all coming to an end, and there wasn't a thing you could do about it. I wasn't a massive fan of going to school. Everybody from our area went to St Mary's, and I reckon I must have had about 20 cousins there too. I wasn't a great scholar, but I did actually go there from time to time and show me face. It seemed my home life was in turmoil more often than not, so sometimes school seemed like the better option. This brings us back to my dad. At the time, he was living a double life. Seriously. He wasn't a spy or anything glamorous like that, but it was just as bizarre. He lived with 2 families, and he was quite open about it. My mum could do nothing about it because, well, Dad would have just lifted his hands to her. He stayed at our house 3 days a week. Tuesdays, Thursdays and Sundays. Sundays were not that bad. Dad started to drink in the house rather than down the pub, and my mum would try and keep him sober for as long as possible. It was the Tuesdays and Thursdays that I hated the most, because on those nights he would be blind drunk and would get really violent. I remember sitting at school one day and it was just after we'd had our lunch. The teacher mentioned what day it was. Tuesday. Shit, I thought to myself. My dad would be mortal, and we'd all be in for a hard night ahead, depending on his mood. Without a drink, he was a loving, caring dad, but the evil drink changed him, and he'd think nothing of laying into me and my brothers, and then my mum for trying to stop him. It'd be the same procedure week in, week out, but it started getting worse, and that's when he started dragging us outside into the backyard and leaving us there to fend for ourselves for the night. We were in the house having our tea, listening for him to arrive. There was an eerie silence. Always the dark threat, like a storm brewing above the house, the black clouds gathering and building by the minute. We'd steal nervous glances at each other. Eyes would dart around the room at any sound we heard, hoping it would pass and calm would prevail. Dad had a haulage business at the time, and all his wagons worked for Scottish and Newcastle breweries. He had 5 or 6 wagons, and his yard was on Skinnerburn Road on the quayside, and in those days, the drayman who delivered the beer would have a drink in all the bars they delivered to, so you could just imagine the state they got themselves into on a daily basis. Nice work if you can get it, eh? This night we heard his wagon drive up the street, and he was shouting out the window. He could probably be credited with inventing road rage. You've seen nothing like it. He was mortal drunk. Again. So Mum sent us to bed to get away from him. He came in through the front door and he was full of himself, shouting for his tea. It was a typical scene for our family. It's only when you see something like Our Friends in the North, where Geordie's dad used to goad him and beat him, that you realise it may have been like that for other kids and abused mothers. As though it were the right of the breadwinner to get hammered after a hard day's work and make him pay for his life not being what he wanted it to be. He couldn't have been happy, because he was living his double life, trying to escape something and have a different version of himself with other people. Anyway, I'm no psychiatrist. We were very young. We didn't deserve to be treated like that. No one does. Michael was 4, I was 6, and John was 8. We all got into the same bed and waited. Our breathing slowed as we struggled to hear what was going on, but of course it turned out we didn't need to struggle. You'd be able to hear him from outside or a few houses down the street. And that was when it all kicked off. Him slapping her, us running downstairs to help and getting thrown out into the yard. But me and my brothers are quick learners. After our first night in the kennel, we decided to give it a facelift. It was about 6 feet long and 4 foot wide and 3.5 foot tall. Bizarrely, we only had one dog. I know, it sounds like enough room for a pack of them. It was a pretty decent size for just one, and a cosy size for 3 extra kids. She probably did mind, but she didn't show it. As a kid or grown up, there's no better feeling than your pet snuggling up to you on a night, and to do it in those circumstances made it all the more special for us. So, for all of us really, we gave it a makeover that would have had George Clark wetting his pants, carpets and blankets in to keep us warm and snug, and kept Judy in the lap of luxury in between our visits. The kennel became a regular punishment in our early days, and looking back on that time of my life now, I can see that it changed us as people. He drummed it into us that under no circumstances should we say anything to the police. It's one thing that stayed with us and served us well. I remember another one of my dad's drunken interrogations quite clearly. He made our John go out of the room, placed a bottle on the chair, and then shouted for him to come back in. Me and our Michael were just watching, but both of us were very suspicious. You have to understand, the script never changed. It was always about how to conduct yourself when arrested or in a police station, and some of the tricks the police would do to fit you up. Our John walked into the room and he just stood there looking at this bottle on the chair and also looking at me and our Michael for some kind of hint. We couldn't help him because we were none the wiser. John decided not to touch the bottle. Dad gave him a slap with the back of his hand and that was that. Test over. Getting the back of the hand rather than the face of the hand was a result. Dad's training wasn't wasted. 10 years later, 3 men robbed a newsagent in North Shields and the owner got squirted with a toxic substance, probably ammonia. They got away with 10k and John and a friend of ours called Peter Morrison, aka Cabs, were nicked for it. After getting woken up in the middle of the night by 2 detectives, our John was taken to the interview room. When he walked in, there was a bottle on the chair for one purpose and one purpose only. For our John to pick it up and leave his fingerprints on it. Well, John had flashbacks to the early memory of our dad and his interrogations came flooding back. He knew instantly what was happening, so he ignored the bottle, much to the annoyance of the police. The fact that John was wise to this tactic, and the evidence for the defence given by a good friend of ours, helped to sway the case in the lad's favour, and they got a not guilty. My dad was a villain. There's no getting away from it. He was a bloody good one at that. But he did dabble in legitimate business now and then, and he ran a very successful scrapyard at one time in Newcastle, as well as his haulage business. I started hanging around there and making a few quid from the age of 8 or so, but I was aware that my dad had his finger in a few pies, and it seemed that more than often he would be up to no good. He'd always say to us that if he ever got nicked, we'd need to get rid of anything he left in the house. He'd never leave anything in the house though, so I guess it was just a precaution, but it was one which would serve us well. So we got word that my dad's cousin had been arrested. Even at this age we knew the procedure. We checked the house over from top to bottom and there was nothing incriminating lying around or hidden away. It was one of those old-style houses where downstairs 2 rooms had been knocked into one and had glass doors separating them. I was just about to sit down when I saw an old suitcase on the floor that we must have missed earlier. I don't see how you could miss anything like that. I'm surprised we hadn't tripped over the thing when we were searching. I picked it up as our John came into the room and wasn't sure whether to open it or not, but curiosity got the better of us, and we put it on the table and unclipped the locks before slowly opening it. The suitcase was neatly packed full with money on both sides. I'll never forget the look on our John's face. No doubt the expression on my face was just the same. As we were looking at each other, my mum walked in and her face was a picture too. We all just stood and stared for what seemed like 2 or 3 minutes before the realisation hit my mother and she slammed the suitcase shut. "Ah, me babies, you can't see this. We'll all be arrested." She threw herself over the case to protect us from it. Even at 8 years old, I'd learned not to panic, and with the help of our John, we managed to calm her down. We told her that we knew what we had to do. We assumed that the police would come bursting through the door at any minute, so there was no time to lose. We emptied the suitcase into an old army duffel bag and we were off with it before the police turned up. We headed up Elswick Road to the cemetery. To most people it was just a run-down, vandalised and overgrown cemetery. It was anything but that to us. It was everything. It was our playground, headquarters and our stamping ground, and we knew it like the back of our hand. Even at that age, we'd earned a bit of a reputation with the local constabulary. Hard to believe, I know. And to them, we were the Elswick Mafia boys. Not a bad name to have, eh? The grass in the cemetery was over 4 foot long in places, which made a great hiding place. Which was just as well, because within minutes of us getting there with the bag, we saw the police arrive at our house. They were there for a while, searching high and low, but found nothing. As they were leaving, I saw one of them stare straight over to where we were hiding, like he could sense us watching him. Or worse, he could actually see us. It was getting dark though. Unless he was RoboCop, we should be safe. We stayed hunched down, one hand each on the bag, poised, ready to leg it, our hearts racing. There was one tomb in the cemetery that we could both move. We'd used it as a place to hide in when we were playing games, so we instinctively knew to make our way over there. Sure enough, there was a gap, and it just took a bit of pushing and pulling to move the concrete slab to give us just enough room to drop down into. We chucked an old length of rope into the duffel bag, so we got it out, tied it to the handle, and lowered the bag down into the darkness. It all seemed a bit too easy, like it was old rope for money. And that's when we heard shouting and screaming. Not from inside the tomb, though. It was someone being chased by the police, with their torchlights swinging from side to side as they ran. Without thinking, we both slid our way down into the tomb, pulling at the grass and stones to cover our tracks, but leaving a little gap to spy from. We held our breath as we watched the coppers' boots pace up and down past our hiding place, looking at each other, our eyes widening at how mad the situation was. I was sure we were going to get caught. It was like the police knew we were there, but were just toying with us, letting us suffer in an old grave before deciding enough was enough. After another pass, they called it a night. That's when me and John breathed out for the first time in what seemed like hours. It was only when we could see their backs far away that we knew we were in the clear. You might think that hiding in an old tomb would scare the shit out of an 8-year-old boy, but not me. Not saying I was like Robert the Bruce hiding in his cave or anything. I mean, it was dark and dingy, but the thing for me was that the tomb was secure, just like the dog kennel in our backyard. To be there in the tomb with our John, protecting my dad's money, or whoever's it had been, felt natural to me. And I never doubted myself for a second. I knew in my heart what I was doing was right. Once the coast was clear and we climbed out with the bag, we couldn't help ourselves. We took another look into it. "How much do you think is in?" asked our John. "I reckon $1 million, I replied. I put my hand in my pocket, pulled out a penny, and I chucked it on top of the notes. "There's over $1 million now," I said, and we both started laughing. 8 years old and millionaires. We were never going to be 9-to-5ers after that, were we? As the days went by, we stayed in the cemetery and kept watch over the tomb. It was crazy what you could witness on Elswick Road late at night. There was prostitution on the streets during the 70s, and all the pubs were full. There was a lot of drunken violence and domestic violence kicking off all the time. If it wasn't something on the street, we could hear the dramas going on inside people's houses from our hiding place. We'd armed ourselves with a little stick and we'd nabbed a kitchen knife each on the way out, and with our loyal dog who would attack on our command, we felt like little soldiers guarding the crown jewels. We were there for 3 days and nights. It turned out they'd already nicked my dad and had him and his cousin in for questioning on an unrelated offence. The mandatory holding time when you were nicked back then was 3 days, and once they were released without charge, we handed the money back over. We expected a bit of praise, but didn't come. We did what we were supposed to do, so why should we be thanked? That was my dad's take on it. He said our true reward was in the experience of it all. Looking back, I agree. He was right. About a year later, some bloke got nicked in a foreign country trying to pass some of the notes over. It turned out they were forgeries. In fact, they were the best the FBI had ever seen at the time. It felt even more like we'd been part of something bigger. As I turned 11, my dad abandoned our family altogether and decided to bring his other family up instead. Even though this put an end to the drunken interrogations and beatings, all I ever wanted was my dad back home. It's what every kid wants deep down. A few weeks after he moved out, I saw him in the street and I begged him to come home, but he just ignored me. On another occasion, he passed me in his car with his new family, and I waved at him, and he blanked me again and drove straight past. I was devastated. I couldn't stop crying. I felt so unwanted and lonely. No one should have to go through that. I'm not putting all this together to say whether he was right or wrong or good or bad. He was all of them, just like everyone else is. We do things, we act, we react, and a lot of the time we don't really understand why. We just do it and live and breathe and carry on because that's what life is, getting through it whichever way you decide to. Those memories have never left me, and on many occasions I've revisited the incidents in my mind, and they've given me the strength to move forward and overcome any obstacles that have been put in my way. So what did my dad's unique method of fatherhood produce? I'll tell you. 3 hardened criminals who feared nobody and who could tackle any situation. Do I hold a grudge against my dad for the way he treated us? Do I fuck? I love him. Rightly or wrongly, it was his way of preparing the 3 of us for a life of crime, and his teaching gave us the advantage over all our rivals. Many would say we were born into it. All we did was go into the family business, just like loads of you did who are reading this. Would I say we were born into it? Probably. But I'll let you decide. We all become who we want to be in the end though, don't we? You could be born into anything, shaped and moulded by your environment, your parents, family, your peers. We all take our influences from all over the place. To some extent, we, the sayers, are a product of our environment, which isn't a bad thing. We love the West End, and our name has become synonymous with the place, and I love that. And to be able to have lived a life that you, the reader, is interested in, is a great feeling for me. You've read all the stuff in the newspapers, you've heard all the rumours, all the whispers in bars, and you may know a few things about us, our reputations and what we've done. Now it's time to hear the real story. The story of the Sayers family, and my side of it all. So, sit yourself down, get comfy, and let the bad lads into your life.